Okay, wonderful. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the November edition of Cells to Society seminar. My name is Andrew with UVM Extension Center for Sustainable Ag, and I help to coordinate this series along with Chris Callahan and Hans Estrin. Today's topic is communications, and we're excited to have two great speakers with us. The first presentation is going to be Movement Media, the Communication Strategies of Social Justice Movements with Ben Dangl. And second, we'll have Sarah Williamson presenting Beyond KPIs, Visualizing Data for Women's Health Equity. A bit more about Cells to Society. Our overall goal is to promote connections, transfer of knowledge, transdisciplinary collaboration, effective leverage of research findings, identification of new questions, and collective impact. So this seminar series is meant to be an opportunity to promote collaboration and ultimately to weave a stronger network of relationships and professional connections across UVM. So here's the team currently working on putting our seminar together. So thanks again to Chris and Hans, as well as Kathy and the rest of the media team. This is a collaborative effort, so please send us your suggestions at the link at the bottom of the slide at go.uvm.edu/cells to society seminar. You can also view the schedule and past recordings there as well. So the way that it works is that we have these monthly virtual seminars, including the one you're seeing today, and it's designed to be an opportunity to share research, education, and work with CALs and beyond. So these seminars typically have 2 speakers each, and then we have a quarterly out-of-the-box brainstorming session happening every 3 months or after every 2 seminars, where we select multiple emerging themes for potential new projects and discuss them in small groups. So this is a much more engaged and interactive collaboration around themes and project brainstorming, and hopefully some new grant proposals as well. So the standing schedule is every second Thursday at 2 p.m., which will occasionally change the time or the date like today. So stay tuned in the coming weeks for more information about upcoming seminars. So again, if you have any suggestions, please submit them at the link shown at the bottom of the screen. And finally, you can visit the Cells to Society website, seen here, for more information on upcoming seminars and links to recordings of the past seminars. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Ben, to get us started.
Okay, great. Let's get this. All right. So can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my research and some of the questions I'm exploring in this field. So let me just see here. I'm trying to get the. Okay. So my name is Ben Dangl. I'm a journalist. I'm a researcher of Latin American social movements. I teach in public communication in the Department of CDAE here in Cal. So thanks again for joining me today. So I'm going to be talking about a topic that's been really near and dear to my heart for a number of years. As a journalist in Latin America, I've covered a lot of social movements, social justice movements for progressive change, particularly in Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. And as a researcher, I've covered how these movements organize, the history of these movements, indigenous movements, labor movements, et cetera. And one of the things that's started to interest me more while I was teaching some of these topics in PCOM as a lecturer was the communication strategies of social movements. So we talk a lot about in my public communication classes, like how to produce journalism, how to produce communication content and outreach material for nonprofits and businesses and community organizations. But social movements also have PR strategies, right? They also have strategies to get their message out. So this is something that's been intriguing me for a while, and I'm enjoying digging into this. So what I'm going to talk about today are some general frameworks and questions that I have that I'm following. And one of the things that I've drawn from that I wanted to give appropriate credit to right off the start is this fantastic book right here called Reimagining Change: How to Use Story-Based Strategy to Win Campaigns, Build Movements, and Change the World. So I'm going to be drawing from some of the examples from this book, but an overview of what I'll be talking about today is the following. I'll be starting off with a discussion of some helpful theories that help us understand how to look at social movement communication strategies and some frameworks for understanding why this is important. I'm going to look at a few different examples of how movements use these strategies. And I'm going to be looking at the tactics that movements use: direct action, boycotts, and other direct action tactics, and how those tell a story. And then finally, how we can use these different tools that I'll be talking about to read social movements. And by read them, I mean analyze them when we're seeing them in the streets, understand them when we're seeing them reported on in the media, and how to research them, which is what I'm doing. So what are the kind of questions we ask that could guide this? So that's what I'll be doing today. And the photo here is one of my favorite photos in the world. It's by Sebastian Salgado, a Brazilian photographer. And it's a photo of the Western Hemisphere's biggest social movement. It's the Brazilian Landless Farmers Movement, the MST, and they have millions of members. And here they are holding up their machetes and implements, demanding land reform under the slogan, which has guided the movement for decades now, which is occupy, resist, produce. So occupy unused land, resist displacement, and use that land for production. So I thought this was a helpful photo just to start things off because it really encapsulates some of the energy of a lot of these movements that I'll be talking about. So the first example that I'd like to bring up in terms of theories is the work by Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci was an Italian theorist who was jailed by Mussolini in the 1930s, and he wrote this book while in jail called The Prison Notebooks. And one of the most important takeaways from Gramsci's thinking was his conception of hegemony. And he was coming against some other Marxist thinkers, some other thinkers in the communist world at this time, who thought that simply by taking state power and exerting control over the country, that the Marxist revolution has one state power, and that having control of the state is enough. And Gramsci, who was involved in watching the spread of fascism under Mussolini, thought it's not just about being in power of the government, controlling the police and military. It's also about this cultural hold on society and creating a kind of common sense values that we live our lives by. And Gramsci said, in order to win a revolution, in order to create some kind of positive change, we need to look to how unions were working in northern Italy when he was working there as an organizer and an intellectual before he was imprisoned, to say, look, in order to change the world, in order to change Italy, in order to work for this kind of labor or socialistic revolution, we need to understand hegemony. And he was engaging with this as a way to understand how governments, how societies exert control over society. And one way to think about this that he talked about was how hegemony is constructed through violence, through the police, through the military, through propaganda and economic power, the threat of violence, right? And through this, states are able to exert control. But another more important thing comes up, which is how people live their lives, the values that we live our lives around, how common sense is created, and what we understand to be politically and socially possible. What is possible? What isn't possible? These are some of the questions that social movements engage with all the time because they're used to having people say to them, what you are demanding is impossible, right? And so by embracing hegemony as a social force from below, Gramsci said that we can expand the scope of what people believe is possible. I'll look at a few examples to elaborate on this further. So one of the ways that this happens, and this is from the Reimagining Change book that I just showed, is through the development of narratives that still exist, that exist in our regular lives now, that hold the status quo together like a glue. These can marginalize critics, normalize suffering, legitimize structural violence, and just have us accept business as usual and not question it. And so there are a few examples here that I wanted to bring your attention to. One is the idea that trickle-down economics is enough to just respect the market, believe in the market, believe that trickle-down economics are going to help the working class, and to say, okay, capitalism is fine, let's not question it. Another one is the bootstrap myth, that by embracing the American dream, we can lift ourselves up by our bootstraps and just work really hard and get there. And these are myths that kind of mask the violence of capitalism, mask the exploitation of capitalism, and have us accept things as they are, right? And so what movements do, and what Gramsci encourages us to think about hegemony from below, is construct a narrative that takes on these status quo myths, these languages, these discourses, these narratives that construct our understanding of what is possible. And Gramsci said we need to look not just to the state, or not the state at all in some cases, but to embrace what he called organic intellectuals, teachers, priests, union leaders, workers, people who have a kind of influence in their social lives, but who don't hold political power. They hold a different kind of power, and they can challenge these hegemonic narratives that shape our lives and create a different narrative. And this photo here from the March for Women's Lives is an example of people marching for the right to birth control, marching for reproductive health, marching for legal access, healthy, safe access to abortion, and to push against a hegemonic discourse that say you shouldn't have the right to this reproductive health, you shouldn't have these rights, right? So by understanding this idea of hegemony as a lens to understand how movements operate, I think it's important to understand how movements can create discourses that challenge hegemonic narratives about what is possible, what is impossible. It can change our understanding about social relations, how we create a different kind of politics and work toward a different kind of horizon than what the hegemonic forces in society want us to believe, right? So here's one tool in our toolbox, a theoretical tool that we can use as a lens to understand what progressive social justice movements are doing in terms of hegemony. So creating this counter-hegemonic discourse, these narratives from below. And so all kinds of movements do this. This is a photo here of the opposition, the indigenous-led opposition to the North Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. This was a big uprising in 2016 and the years around then that were led by indigenous communities who were going to be displaced by an oil pipeline going through their territory, polluting their land, polluting their rivers without sufficient consent. And this is an example, and there's many, that of a movement creating a narrative that is challenging the status quo, that's challenging the state's policy, the corporate policy, to say, no, we're going to rely on fossil fuels. We're going to put this pipeline through your territory. We don't care what you think. We're going to do it no matter what. And we're going to paint all of you who are resisting as criminals, as violent criminals who need to be locked up and controlled, right? And they created this narrative to say, no, we are peaceful resistors. We are heirs. We are carrying on a legacy of indigenous resistance. We are promoting an alternative to climate crisis, and we're promoting a more sustainable solution to reject our reliance on fossil fuels. So they're creating a narrative that challenges the hegemonic one, right? So there's one example. Another one is when we're looking at these movements, to understand how movements often center the voices and stories of people who are most impacted by the issue. So here, in the case of Standing Rock, we have movement leaders, indigenous activists saying, we aren't just experts, we aren't just professors sitting in our offices, we aren't just politicians who have no stake in the game. We are people who are living this crisis. We're going to be displaced. We're drinking this water. Our land is being poisoned. You should listen to us, right? So this gives them some clout. And so it's always helpful when we're looking at movements to say, who has the mic? Who is speaking on behalf of these communities? Are they the stakeholders? Do they have, are they being impacted directly by this? So it's always helpful to analyze things in this way. And this is one of the things that many movements that I'm talking about, that I look at in my research, are doing, centering the voices of people most impacted by an issue. That's something that I wanted to focus on. The other thing, and here's a photo of the Survivors March in Los Angeles, 2017, as a part of the Me Too movement. And here we have another example of a movement that totally upended our understanding of violent patriarchy's hold on society and how it silences survivors, and it changes the discourse about what these predatory men have done over the years. And in this case, so many people in high levels of society and culture and Hollywood were outed as predators and abusers. And so this movement was about telling people's own stories, right? And so one of the things that I like to think about is how movements do this so that the purpose is to create a story about whatever the demands are, whatever the story of the stakeholders, the people most impacted by these issues, create a narrative around this, a story before somebody else does. Because the enemy, the political opponents will always say, oh, in this case, in the Me Too movement, critics will say, oh, we can't trust the survivors. We need to get more, we need to double check these stories. We're going to silence these survivors. They're untrustworthy, et cetera. But if movements don't tell their own stories, someone else does. So that's why it's important for movements to do this, and they are doing it, and they have done it. But I think it's a helpful lens to consider that when we're examining how a story is framed, how an issue is framed, we understand that it's a battle. It's a battle of ideas. It's a battle of stories. And if somebody else doesn't do it, if you don't meme your message, you risk your opponent doing it for you. So all of this feeds into what is helpful to think about as symbolic and institutional contests for change. So when we're thinking about the march toward a policy change or social change of some sort, or shifting the power dynamics around a certain issue. In this case, the photo here is from the movement for Black Lives Matter, to reform the police, to defund the police. They have a whole host of demands coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in this case, in the case of Black Lives Matter, there's a symbolic and an institutional contest, which is helpful to think about when we're examining how social movements communicate. So the symbolic contest is really what the communication side of this is all about. It's all about developing narratives, symbols, meaning, and a kind of common sense, right? Winning this is necessary but insufficient, but it does lay the groundwork for the institutional victory to say, okay, how did the Me Too movement, how did Black Lives Matter, how did the Standing Rock protests, how did all of these lay the symbolic, the narrative framework, the foundation, so that we can understand the issue in a different way, so that we have the narrative resources, the stories, the frameworks to understand this story in a different way than the people with all the power have. The people at the top have all the, in government, in corporations. So the symbolic contest is a great way to think about how these movements communicate their strategies, and it lays the groundwork for the institutional contest, when you're actually moving through with the policy change that will create broader reproductive rights access, end police brutality, keep the oil in the ground and not move it through the Standing Rock territory, right? So thinking of these different contests is another helpful lens to understand how movements communicate. So one of my areas of research over the years has been in Bolivia, and I focused a lot on labor and indigenous movements in Bolivia as a journalist and researcher. And this is a photo here of protests in 2003 against a plan to export Bolivian natural gas reserves for a very low price to the US. And here, Bolivians rose up in an uprising, which I was a reporter during this, working in Bolivia at the time, to say we want the gas to be used in Bolivia for national development. And as a part of this, they hauled off these train tracks in the photo here. They hauled off these train cars off the tracks, and put them on a major highway to block the road. And this forced people with power to pay attention to their demands. So there was this protest. There was another protest against a plan to privatize Bolivia's water in Bolivia in 2000, which was a kind of David and Goliath scenario where people in the city of Cochabamba, in one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, rose up against a plan by Bechtel, one of the biggest multinational corporations in the world, to say, we don't want Bechtel to privatize our water. We want it to be under public control and public management. So in both of these cases, these led into indigenous movements organizing against extractivism, organizing against corporate looting of their natural resources, but they framed things in a way, in the case of the Cochabamba water war, of this David and Goliath scenario. And this was a narrative, a framework to help people understand the stakes and understand which side people should be on. The other one with the gas war was, the narrative was to say, as a country, Bolivia has been exploited for hundreds of years. We now want to use our natural resources for national development, to lift up the country's impoverished majority. We want to use our natural resources under state control to build hospitals, to develop funds for schools, et cetera. And so these narratives were really important. These were communication strategies of these movements. So in the examples of Bolivia, indigenous movements have risen up in the case of the Cochabamba water war, the Bolivian gas protest, to really reshape the narrative around national belonging, to say we, people, in the streets were saying, we as the indigenous majority believe we are the heirs, the rightful heirs of these natural resources. We are the custodians of our environment. We believe that we should have a say in how these resources are exploited. Groups use oral history to create narratives around indigenous resistance and what that means in the country. They promoted narratives and tactics for decolonization at the state level to promote indigenous languages, to create more spaces for indigenous politicians, and shifted the narrative around what it means to use natural resources for national development. The Black Lives Matter movement also uses a lot of these same strategies. We think of the name Black Lives Matter. The phrase itself has a very clear demand in it. I can't breathe when Eric Gardner was killed by police. I mean, this is a phrase that sent shockwaves throughout the world and was used as a banner to make visible this violence, this structural violence, right? So when we examine some of these protest slogans, it is both a blueprint for creating visibility around our work, which is one of the organizers, how they describe these tactics. And it's a way to basically expose some of the fissures, the cracks in society, and show people how things really work in the eyes of the organizers, right? And so, how are we doing on time here? Let's see, let me just want to make sure that I have enough time for my colleagues. So moving on to tactics here. So nonviolent direct action is a tactic that was used widely throughout the civil rights movement. And here's a quote from Martin Luther King that speaks to these tactics. He says that nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. So when activists use direct action, they're really telling a story about where the power lies. You telling a story about a power analysis about, okay, we are marginalized on the sidelines of the struggle. It brings people to the negotiating table to force a negotiation. It can disrupt oppressive systems, and it can also model the future that people want, right? It can be a way, the organizing can actually be a model for what people see in a nonviolent future. And so other forms of direct action can tell a story in the sense that they focus on the point of intervention. They tell a story by focusing on the problem and making visible where the problem is. And here's a photo of Greenpeace trying to make an intervention in stopping whale killing. So you can see here where they're making an action. They have a communication strategy here, and they're right there in front of a whale which is being captured by Japanese ships. And so the other way that movements tell stories through direct action is by taking an intervention at the point of production, where workers who might be exploited at a factory or a corporation their struggle is being made visible by going on strike, right? There might be a direct action that is stopping tractors from going and continuing with mining and logging by stopping those tractors at the point of destruction. Another one would be at the point of consumption, where sweatshops are made, or through consumer boycotts, and the point of decision, where activists will gather around the White House or places where people gather to make big decisions that people are against and focus on that. So these are a few more ways where the action itself can tell a story. So just to wrap up, some helpful questions that I find useful in my own research on these topics, and I teach, as well as some ways that are helpful in terms of media analysis and media literacy. When we're seeing protest movements in the streets or in the news, ask yourselves, who has the mic? Who is the most impacted by this issue? Do they have a voice in the movement? How are people shaping the symbolic contest around it that's leading the way to the institutional contest? What do the protest signs say? What do the banners say? What solutions is the movement advancing? When we just dismiss protests as ineffective and we don't use these analytical tools, we do them a disservice by not taking them seriously and respect the thinking and strategizing that goes behind these communication efforts. So I think that by looking at these, we can be better allies with movements, stand in solidarity with movements, be better journalists when we're reporting on them, and be better researchers and general consumers of media when we're looking at them. So thank you very much. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Yep.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Ben. All right, can everyone see?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you all for having me, Ben. I really enjoyed that, and I think it does have some cross connection to what I'll be talking about today, specifically when we're thinking about like photographing and communicating social movements, but also communicating other social problems that exist that we talk about in our classroom. So I hope that this intersects a bit. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Williamson, and I am also a lecturer in CDAE. And I thank you for having me, and I second Ben, and that I'm really excited to just be able to talk a bit about some of the projects that I work on for different international nonprofits, and also my work just in looking at data visualization. Although I talk about this in my classes, I don't often talk specifically to what I'm doing within these projects in like a long-term presentation like this. So today I am going to talk about beyond KPIs, which are key performance indicators, and how to visualize data for women's health equity. I wanted to just point out the classes that I teach, just in case anyone is interested in getting to know each other. There's a lot of people that I don't know in this room. This is my second year in Cal, so still getting to know outside of CDAE's kind of been my home so far. But these are the courses that I teach, and I think that my talk today will really touch on the communication design course and also the narrative data design course. Also very much what I teach and what I do is very much interwoven, right? So I am a visual storyteller. I started off as a photographer and doing marketing and fundraising for nonprofits. And then this moved into telling stories with data, not just with physical imagery and illustration. So we'll look at that a bit. But what I will focus on specifically is how we humanize data, whether it is through images or illustrations or interactivity, and I'll kind of display different examples of that, and also talk about how modes of visual representation can be used photographically, symbolically, and that those can be interwoven with data-oriented approaches. And then we'll talk a bit about some research and a project that is ongoing for a nonprofit called Grounds for Health. So we'll talk a bit about the coffee industry and women's health. So my background is in photography, and I started off working with Her Future Coalition, which is a nonprofit that works specifically in India and Nepal. And they really work towards creating education programs and holistic support to combat sexual and gender-based violence. So this organization has been around for almost 20 years, and I started off doing a lot of photography work for them and storytelling of their survivors and the women and girls that they work with. And so here's just some imagery just to share with you on some of the work that I've done in India. But that really leads to how I have formed these other forms of visual communication, not just in photos. And something that I share with my class often is that, you know, the rules of photography and the rules of what makes imagery look beautiful and what makes people respond to certain images really can cross over into other methods of communication. So not just photography, but also into infographics, also into data visualization, also into illustration. And so we kind of touch on really what makes an image look good. And it's the same principles. It's about filling the frame. It's about using patterns and lines and thinking about where viewers focus most of their attention, right? And so we talk about this in my illustration classes as well as my data classes. And, you know, I always push in a little bit of photography, but I actually don't formally teach any photography classes. So it's interwoven within my practice. So information design is definitely changing as a field and as a field of study. And, you know, what are we're thinking about data in a really more storytelling and narrative way. And so even if you're using information design as part of your research, or perhaps a poster presentation at a conference, there's different ways that you can incorporate stories in visual form within data graphics. And you can actually include photography, include these things. David McCandles, if you haven't heard of him, started Information is Beautiful, and check it out if you haven't. I'm sure many of you have, but he talks a lot about how it's also about making data and information accessible for users, you know, so that this is now displayed for many audiences. And if you work in an organization or you're working at a research institution, you're sharing your work with a lot of different people. And so there's different methods to use in order for people to actually really engage with it. So we talk about that a lot in my classes. Something that we also focus on in my data visualization course is kind of the beginning, right, of how data visualization started, and also who were some of the pioneers in visualizing data. And this is specific to public health, which is a bit what I'll be talking about with my research for Grounds for Health. So Florence Nightingale was a pioneer in design. I can't see your faces, so I don't know if you've seen this before. But she was focused she's a statistician, a British nurse, and was very much a pioneer in that she developed this new form of a pie chart. And it's a polar area diagram, and she was able to show the number of deaths in the Crimean War. But it wasn't based on actual battle. It was based on the sanitation and the processes of what were happening in these different areas where soldiers were wounded, and if nurses were washing their hands and where the water was coming from and all of these things. And they realized, oh, because of this graph and her analysis and her pictorial analysis, why there was more mortality in some of these areas was actually connected to sanitation. So I like to share a lot of her work because I see her as a pioneer, as a data artist in some ways, but also a nurse, and seeing those two fields blend is really cool. So when we think about humanizing data, and of course, we all have different connections with data depending on the work that we do here at UVM and what we're teaching, but there's always some sort of, collection process. Then we're looking for correlations, and then we're looking at significance and what makes this data important and how does this fit into our research? What is the story it's telling? But when we're thinking about humanizing data, often it's not really spoken about who are the people that are actually involved, whether it's involved in the collection process, whether it's involved in actually those who have been impacted, that Ben, pointed out too, is like a lot of this data and what we're providing these stories, maybe those that are actually involved in the data process aren't really involved in the display or how it's used, right? So when we're thinking about humanizing data, we want to talk specifically about the people involved and how do we incorporate them into what we're showing visually. So data humanist and designer who I am a huge fan of, she's an Italian data artist, she would consider herself as, is Giorgia Lupi. And I talk about her a lot in my classes and introduce, these ideas of thinking about how we look at data. We think about big data, or we think about, data is always very descriptive, it's predictive, it's impartial, but like, how can we actually look at data and think about it in a more human way, right? And think about small data and think about how there's subjectivity in data, and also about the possibilities and complexity that we can depict within data that you might not think about unless you have kind of a multimodal way of displaying what you found. And I think number one is that data isn't just numbers, right? It's people, and there's people involved in most of all of the work, that we are doing, whether it is, even if it is research on farming and agriculture and soil science, there are still people involved, and there's reasons behind why we're doing this research. So including them, it is an important part of my process. I'm going to just focus a bit more on Giorgia Lupi because I really think she's a great example of this. And this is a project that she did, and I think this was displayed in New York Times, and there was a couple other media outlets that picked it up during the pandemic, where she wanted to display data, real life data of actually the good things that were happening during the pandemic, happy data, like not just so depressing of all of the cases and what we were seeing at home and from our, our chairs and isolation. So she looked at this data points of, okay, there was pollution levels were going down. Professional athletes are giving a lot more money, and let's incorporate imagery with this data. And a lot of her work is also hand drawn, which also humanizes this element. It doesn't all have to be done on a computer. I think that moving back into the analog process is really important. And one of my first assignments I give for students is actually to do a data, to collect personal data, like within a notebook, and like to look at trends and look at their different behaviors. Maybe they're trying to quit eating chocolate for 7 days, so they know how they're feeling throughout. And so just thinking about ways to analog and personalize your data, and that includes how you're capturing it too. So Giorgia, a great quote from her is, and I think this is why, as in this field, why I'm so attracted to it, is data really does represent real life. And I love how she talks about this as a snapshot of the world in the same way that a picture can capture, that decisive moment in time, right? And it's really just all about how you're displaying it and how you're talking about it. Just a few other examples of Giorgia and some of her work. This is an imaging of mental health in America. And she did this project for the Rand Corporation, and just looking at mental health. And I know it's hard to see on this small screen, but it's a way of taking data. And to me, when I look at this, I start feeling about like our brain waves and like what mental health looks like. We're like under a microscope almost. And so she really allows this data to kind of become art in a way too, which makes people connect with it more, and then zoom in and what does that mean? What do those colors mean? And she just has some great examples of this. Another way of humanizing data is to make it interactive. Many of us, I'm sure, are very familiar with dashboards, and especially when we're looking at Tableau and thinking about ways to make your data clickable and to use scrolling and to really have viewers engage with it instead of it just being the static infographic. That does involve, of course, programming, and there's other types of coding and levels of analysis that are normally done to show this type, but there's also amazing software that's available for folks that aren't really good coders that can actually go in and start displaying their data in an interactive way. And I share a lot of these resources with my students. Okay, so to get a bit to some work that I've done for Grounds for Health. So Grounds for Health is an organization that is actually based in Vermont. The US team is, so it's a small but humble team in Williston, and there's 4 folks that really do all the marketing and fundraising, but all of the rest of the staff that work specifically in these regions, and it's a cervical cancer prevention nonprofit, so I should have started with that. And they've been working in women's health programs and expanding them in farming communities specific to coffee production. So they have a great origin story. I won't go into full detail, but I will give links if you want to learn more about Grounds for Health. But the team of marketing communications is here in the US, but then all of their clinical team and actually the folks that are doing the work are all in country. And they've been in Latin America, and now the programs are currently in Ethiopia and Kenya, Ethiopia being the birthplace of coffee, if you didn't know. And so cervical cancer, without getting too much into the weeds of clinical, it is a preventable cancer. And it's preventable through catching early, through precancer, through HPV testing, through the pap smear that the women in the room know all about, the men know slightly about, but you've never experienced it. And so if you have routine healthcare services, then women aren't dying of this, right? It's actually completely preventable, and it's a horrible cancer to die from. So we're looking at cancer in the coffee belt regions because, ironically, if you look where coffee is grown, and here's an infographic that I know is too small to see that I did for Grounds for Health, showing about the labor and production and where it is in the world is definitely follows with low income and lower middle income countries. And a lot of the women, when 70% of the laborers in coffee that are in the picking, growing, drying are women, don't have access to a lot of these services because they live in really rural, remote areas. And many of the communities that they work in, the women aren't even really sure about what HPV is or what cervical cancer is or what it's caused from and how you can prevent it. And so a lot of the work they do is through education and mobilization. So I'm just checking my time. Okay. So I currently have done different visualizations and data work for them and marketing work. And a specific project that was asked was by the board. They wanted to be able to share the growth and how this organization has really grown and the different methods of technologies that they've used. They are supported by the coffee industry, public health organization, and individual donors. So thinking about all of those different audiences when creating this visualization for them. So they asked, showing their innovation and growth. They had just celebrated their 25 years of being an organization, and they wanted it to be a presentation that people could move through and have some interactions with. So whenever I'm starting an information design project, you're going to think about the pillars. And the pillars for me is looking at the data, the story, the goal, and then the visual form. So I'll walk through kind of what each of these were for this project. So the data was the KPIs, which is the screening and the treating, how many women have been seen. At the end of the day, that's what donors want to know. That's what health organizations, when we're talking to people at Gates Foundation, that's what they want to know. They want to know where our programs are in what countries and what screening methods we're using. Again, I won't get into the weeds, but there's all different types of screening methods that go from very low resource settings with vinegar and a cotton ball to seeing precancerous cells. It's insane. And then there's, the more you're actually going into a health center with a bit more technology focus to be able to do the screening. And then there's also the WHO guidelines that we're very much following. The story that they wanted is community mobilization and growth. How is Grounds for Health screened more women in what countries and how? So they want it, that's their main goal, right? They want to see growth, they want to see expansion. This is a small nonprofit, but we do a lot of work. And they also, the form, they wanted it to, the visual form, to be a static infographic for reports, but then something that's a little bit more interactive that they could share at presentations. So that was the ideas. So the data is all of the screening treatment numbers, the KPIs, the countries you work in, how many women, the providers that are trained. There's all these different levels and details. So our staff in country trains clinical providers to then go to these really rural communities and work with health posts. And health posts are these small little health posts that in Ethiopia, it was a public, I think it was instated like 10, 15 years ago, where every community within 5 kilometers has to have some sort of health post, even if it's extremely rural. But they had never had any cervical cancer prevention involved in those health posts. So how do we get folks there? And how do we use the campaign model to kind of pop into these locations and screen people? Because once you screen people once, if they're negative for HPV over 30, the likelihood of you getting cervical cancer is very, very minimal. So it's actually a model that works really well because you can screen and treat right there. But again, sorry, no clinical weeds. So then I'm thinking, how are we going to think about this data and humanize it and the people behind this, right? We have the volunteers on the left that are setting up in markets and going to coffee farms and are teaching women like right after work or before work or their lunch hour about what cervical cancer is and about what HPV is, and they're telling them to tell their daughters, and there's so much community mobilization that's involved. And then of course there's our lab technicians, and there's the women that are going to be screened and treated themselves, which we don't have a lot of images of, as you can imagine, because this isn't something, as far as, being able to share images in a public health space with privacy, we don't really have a lot of imagery depicting women getting screened, but we do have some here with women holding the HPV test and being happy that they were screened. So thinking more about the people that are beyond these numbers and what makes it work. So I'll kind of move through that quickly. This is, just the data again and going back through. And so this is the static version that was created initially. So it was thinking about growth. It was thinking about countries, and it included all of the different methods. So it moves from PAP to VIA, VIA to HPV, and moving into HPV screening means that we are really innovating because it involves women to actually be able to sample themselves, and you can do it in really low resource areas. So this is showing with HPV testing now how we've been able to grow, right? So that is not the end result though. So I'll open. So it ended up being a full interactive, and I won't go through all of this just because of time, but I wanted to just show you what the final product looked like. So we're joining the journey. We are starting with what the World Health Organization's goals are with eliminating cervical cancer, and HPV testing is one of those methods. We're talking about where we begin with coffee and in Mexico. And then we're leading with community mobilization and education. And here's a photo of our Ethiopian staff that's providing information about HPV and cervical cancer prevention. And then it starts with our evolution and growth. So we start here with the women screened in the PAP tests and what that looked like in Mexico in 1996. And then we have some photos of what that looked like. This is when we still had volunteer clinicians from Vermont going and doing this way before capacity was built, so that we no longer, that's not the model we use anymore, right? We're using completely people within country. And then there's still, the volunteer methods and how we've moved. We're still in Mexico. Here's our executive director who's actually retiring this year. And then we keep moving. 2006, we introduced VIA, and it talks about this new method, applying vinegar to the cervix. And here we have a community health promoter educating people in Nicaragua about what this will feel like. These women have never had a speculum inserted, so it's a learning process. And then cryotherapy is a form of treatment for precancerous lesions, which in the US, you can easily, I have many friends that have had not cryotherapy, but have had the precancerous lesions. And if you have access, it's kind of like an easy, you walk in and they either used freezing the abnormal cells to remove it, and just seeing the different technologies that have changed for treatment. And so we have some pictures of our Ethiopian country director, Ashnafi, who is still our country director. And then we move in more to, it's just growth pictures. and then the new technologies with HPV self-sampling. And then it ends with, again, this kind of growth model. And then we move into the future and striving to expand to reaching 300,000 women by 2025 and how we can do this. And of course, as a nonprofit, you always need to go to how you can support us, right? There's no way to avoid that. So I guess my final thoughts to leave a few minutes for questions, good, 10 minutes, all right, is that clinical data can be beautiful and that data is accessible for all when it's presented through a humanistic and storytelling lens. And communicators in 2023, especially, teaching these courses for students that are entering this world of there's so many ways to communicate. I think that data is an approach that everyone should have touched and at least understand how to use it in certain ways and how to use it in ways with visual imagery as well as illustration, and that it really can work together in order to engage viewers. So that is all that I have. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I am around in Morrill Hall.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ben, as well. Andrew has asked if I could facilitate questions, and I think we have a small enough group where I think we can be pretty informal about this. There are a number of questions in the chat, and I would invite those people, starting maybe with Hans, to just unmute and ask your questions directly. So Hans, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I had a question for each speaker, but maybe I'll start with my first one for Ben. I'm, having sort of grown up with activist father and people in the family, I'm curious and intrigued by communication within activist movements about sort of self-care and burnout and how that can impact the long-term long-term movements that really require superhuman patience and endurance.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Great question. And thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation. Really fascinating. Yeah. And I think that this is a great question. I think a lot about the ways that movements have grappled with how they practice their values or want to prefigure the world they're fighting for within the movements themselves. So if you're fighting for democracy, let's not try to be like fascist in our movement. If you're fighting for participatory economics, let's see how we can share some of the workload together and share the power together. So this question reminds me of different conversations that I've been involved in or heard throughout Latin America and the US, where people are saying, okay, how can we become more democratic? And one example is Occupy Wall Street, which there were pros and cons to this very radically democratic movement, but there was this question of how do we disperse the power? How do we not just have one single leader, right? And there's been other examples of this, but ultimately it gets down to the question of how do we build a better society starting within our movement? And part of that has to do with self-care, and part of it has to do with not with preventing burnout and preventing a system or a structure within the movement that allows one leader to be in power for 30 years and abuse that power. So building the systems within the movements themselves, whether it's about how do you sustain road blockades in Bolivia for 30 days, or how do you coordinate a boycott in South Africa, or how do we pressure this corporation to do X, Y, and Z from, migrant justice, for example, pressuring Hannaford right now. How do we create a system that's supportive of each other? I think it has to do with these models that have been in place, I think more and more in contemporary movements that are trying to avoid some of the centralization of power and this growth mentality, which is, okay, we have one charismatic leader, let's have it all focused around them. And we just need to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that leads to burnout, and it leads to a distraction from the actual goals and more just about this growth mentality, which mirrors the capitalist mentality, which is everywhere. So I think those are some of the ways that I think movement leaders and movements are grappling with that. And I also have a lot of journalists visit my journalism classes, and this is increasingly a question that my students ask me: how do you handle burnout and how do you handle self-care? And more journalists are talking about that too, thinking about it for themselves. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks.
Sarah, as somebody directly involved in public health, any thoughts on the health of those involved in public health initiatives?
I'm sorry, can you say the last part again?
Just anything to say on that question that Hans provided in terms of self-care of those involved in the movements?
It's interesting. I was just talking to students about not so much activism, but thinking of students' mental health and actually mapping your mental health. And when I was talking earlier about personal data collection and actually looking at, there's a really great, I'm sitting here looking right now at the book, so I'll share it. It's Observe, Collect, Draw. It's by Georgia Lupi. And it literally, if you were involved in, you were campaigning or you're working in some activist movement, you could actually collect personal data on the work you were doing and what types of feelings and emotions that were coming, like based on that, and you could track it. And there's ways of tracking personal data to actually see what work you would rather be involved in within the movement, right? Because oftentimes we really jump right in and we're kind of doing everything, especially for small movements, right? But we're all kind of meant to be doing specific things. We can't all, jump in and be the ones yelling and speaking. Maybe there's more of the research side and providing mental health after. I'm someone who's really afraid of large crowds. So I can't really go to big protests. So what could I do? And thinking about data as a way to look into those reflections.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Joanna, I see Joanna, you have several questions. Please feel free to unmute and ask.
Hi, well, the questions I have for Sarah, I'm just going to send you an email because there are things that I'm not going to take up somebody's time with. But I did want to ask Ben a question because there's been a lot of conversations about social media and misinformation. And when you're communicating facts, when you're communicating, you want to be the authority. You want to be the one that's hopefully sincerely communicating what your movement is about, what your project is about. But you also have to be so aware of all of these forces that are, for whatever reason, against what you're doing, especially in social movements, and the money that's behind that. And maybe that these people, you can't find the funding, but there's got to be a way that you can at least break through and help people understand how to sort out the misinformation from what's really going on.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Yeah, I think that it's social media has been a great force for movements to have not new platforms, but platforms to reach different audiences and share their stories and cut out the middle person in terms of journalism. And I think that there's another, when you're talking about this, what comes to mind is the way that misinformation has been spread by movements. You could say, in the case of the Trump supporters and people who are, for example, against the science behind vaccinations, right? So people involved in movements that don't hold the same values as some of the movements that I'm researching, right? Who are sharing misinformation as part of their movements. And so one of the things I talk about in my classes in public communication and journalism is the absolute need to focus on facts, data, research-based information so that you aren't feeding into the problem. You aren't misleading people, misguiding people. So I think that analyzing researching how movements create fact-based messages is another important component of looking at how they communicate effectively.
Thanks, Ben. Sarah, anything you'd like to add there?
I think specifically to that, Ben, thinking about just the integrity of data in general. We talk about that a lot in my classes as well, and how data can be manipulated to tell different stories. And I think that just aligns directly with that as well. I didn't know if I should move up to some of the questions up there. For Joanna, the BioRender I don't use for any of my presentations. I don't even really know what that is, and I probably should. But I do everything very, very custom. I try to, for the most part. And then the contract for animations, it really depends. I do a lot of illustration myself as well. But I can give you more resources. Yeah.
Okay, Hans had their hand next, but Hans, since you've already asked, do you mind if I go to Dan and then Thomas? Thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Chris. Hey, thank you, Ben and Sarah. Those were really, really interesting presentations. I enjoyed them enormously. So thank you for doing that. My question is really for either of you, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to it, but I find myself dismayed in the last 5 years at the frequency with which people who know what they know um, can't be swayed with data, with facts, with objectivity, because they're in an emotional place about whatever it is that they know. There's many, many, many examples. There's some obvious ones regarding those who would identify themselves as the MAGA faithful, but I see it in other places too. The pandemic, all of the information, some of which changed over time regarding vaccination and how we protect ourselves, seem to sort of feed that. And I'm just wondering if either of you have brilliant and soothing thoughts to share about how we approach a world in which seems to be increasingly common that people who are dug in on something, and it makes no difference what the objective facts are to these individuals. They're in an emotional place and they're not coming out of it. And it's tough to live that way. So I yield to both of you.
Ben, do you want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
So
Please.
I think it's knowing, and we talk about this a lot in another course, design innovation, and about communicating through folks' values, right? So I think I spend a lot of time with my own family practicing this, but it's really framing the data before you actually even showing it. It's like priming people to feel a certain way before you then share something with them. And so when you're visualizing data and you're trying to share through storytelling, you could actually prime people before they even see the data to be maybe in a more empathic mood. I'm trying to think of an example specifically. You know, I can only really think of my family and my father, who is an anti-vax person and lives in the middle of the woods in Vermont. It's not something that he would ever do, and that's something we've had to be okay with over time. But as soon as you present his elderly mother and how she's in and out of the hospital for respiratory issues undue to COVID, unconnected to COVID, he will start masking and he will start thinking. And it's like, so how do you kind of pull in someone's value systems? Family is his value system, not community, right? And so starting with that as your story and framing is just one method, but it's, again, very complex, but that's just one way to start.
Yeah, I'm happy just to add briefly that, yeah, great question. I think that polarization is a reality in around so many issues in the U.S. and around the world right now, and had a really interesting conversation with Erica Heilman, a podcaster in the NEK of Vermont, who produces a podcast called Rumble Strip. She made a podcast show called What Class Are You? And she talked with my journalism class earlier this week, and she talked exactly about this. And one of the things she does that I think speaks to maybe one direction in an answer to your question, which is talks to people who might not agree with her, or brings different stories of people together who might not agree with each other. In this case of class was one thing where she asked people, what class are you? And this cuts across invisible class lines that we often don't talk about in Vermont or maybe in the US in general. And I think that just beyond the data, connecting with people who are unlike us, who are unlike you, unlike each other, that can be a helpful way to bridge this divide. And it's something that I encourage my journalism students to do, to talk with people who they disagree with and write stories about them. And I think that that can go sometimes beyond the data to see this this commonality that we have, the shared experiences that we have, and that can help break through some of this polarization and isolation and kind of blinders that people have on.
Thank you both. I do recognize we're over the scheduled time, but I think we're reasonably over the scheduled time. Thomas, go ahead.
Actually, it feeds into what Dan was mentioning. It was more of an observation, Ben, of the picture that you shared sort of towards the beginning of your talk of that social movement with the people holding the machetes. And as I was looking at it, I was thinking to myself, if you hadn't described what it was we were looking at, I wouldn't have known. Like it looked equally like a celebration to me. And I think it fits in Dan's context. I was thinking about what Sarah just mentioned about like priming someone with an idea. I was out to eat with some family one time, and the waiter said, like, smelled this bottle of wine, was like, oh, it's gone bad. And at that point, anything you taste, it's going to taste bad, right? They've told you now that it's bad. And we've had just so much of this social priming on so many of these issues. So I just wanted to thank both of you for like a really insightful hour. And I also wanted to thank Sarah for sending out that reminder right before the meeting started, which was what got me here. So just for future ones, whoever's Chris was organizing it, Sarah, your model was very effective. So thanks so much.
Thanks for that, Thomas. Always hard to tell if we're over inviting or over communicating. Thank you. Other questions to wrap up? I see Joanna has one more or one more thought in the chat about having a conversation specifically about communicating
Yeah,
risk
it's
in
just a
agriculture.
thought, Chris,
Yeah.
because we do a lot of that in terms of, well, migrant farmers, agricultural producers, how to get them to be able to do what you like them to do, but there's a lot in terms of like the risk, how much risk someone's willing to take before they'll actually change their mind about something. So that would be a really good conversation to have too.
Yeah, it's a big one in my world too. Thanks, Joanna. I appreciate that.
I'm happy to reach out after and chat more about any of these topics.
Yeah, likewise.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Ben, again very much. Really fantastic presentations and fueling a lot of conversation that'll continue, I think, beyond the seminar today. Andrew, did you want to wrap things up?
No, I think they pretty much said it all. Thanks everybody. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned for our next seminar. Will be taking place on Thursday, December 7th, from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. and we will be having a conversation about resilience. So I hope to see you all there, and thanks again to our speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.